There are moments in history when beauty becomes a crime, when the pursuit of perfection crosses into madness, and an emperor mistakes his own soul for the soul of a nation. This is the story of one such moment, and one such man. A ruler who watched his empire crack and burn, not because he was blind, but because he was listening to music only he could hear. In the dead of night, as the city of Rome slumbered beneath a sky heavy with summer heat, the wind shifted. It wasn't the cool breeze of a blessing. It was the breath of something darker. Somewhere in the Palatine, the emperor stirred. His thoughts were not on borders or war, not on grain or taxes. He was thinking about rhythm, about cadence, about words that could make marble weep, and in that hour history took its first step into fire. Nero Claudius Caesar was not born in a tragedy. He dragged it toward him like a cloak, seduced by the sound of his own voice. They say he loved art more than power, but that isn't true. He loved power that looked like art. He wanted Rome to become his poem, and every citizen a word he could erase or rearrange. He wasn't content to rule the world. He wanted to compose it. To the Senate he was erratic. To the army he was ornamental. But to himself he was divine. He believed his voice could still earthquakes, that his verses could conquer time. When he sang, the palace held its breath, not because his voice was transcendent, but because the consequences of not applauding were. His court became a stage, and every breath in his presence was a line in a play he was writing and rewriting every day. But art demands sacrifice, and Nero, above all, understood this. He did not merely wish to write a masterpiece. He wished to become one, not through restraint, through destruction. He saw beauty not in harmony, but in contrast, the delicate curve of poetry, and the jagged ruin of fire. And so, when he looked upon the ancient streets of Rome, their cluttered alleys and mismatched buildings, he didn't see history. He saw an unfinished draft. There were whispers even before the flames, that Nero had plans, that he wanted a city worthy of his name, not the Rome of bricks and blood, but a Rome of marble and myth, a city reborn in his image, wider streets, grander colonnades, a symmetry only he could see. But how do you remake a city still filled with life? You don't. You let it burn. And so, the torches came. No one knows exactly how it began. A kitchen fire, some said, a lightning strike, but others, too many to ignore, saw men in imperial livery scattering embers like seeds. Buildings went up like paper. The Tiber reflected a sky of ash. Mothers clutched children. Soldiers turned from looters to saviors, then back again. It was chaos, then silence, then wailing, and through it all Nero did not speak. He was not there, they claimed. He was away. But stories spread, stories that he watched from a nearby tower strumming a lyre as flames swallowed the horizon. They say he wore theatrical robes and sang of the fall of Troy, because for him this wasn't disaster. It was art. Rome burned for 6 days. Then briefly it paused, as if the fire itself hesitated, but it returned, more vicious as if answering a conductor's cue. When it finally died, 2/3 of the city lay in ruin. Thousands were dead. More were homeless. And Nero was inspired. He blamed the Christians. Convenient scapegoats, strange in dress and belief, easy to isolate. He offered public executions, theatrical tortures. The crowds came, but even they could feel it. Something beneath the cruelty that was too rehearsed, too performative. It was not justice. It was theater. And Nero was the playwright, the lead actor, and the only audience that mattered. But the fire had done what he intended. With the slums gone, he built anew, a golden palace stretching across the ruins, gardens that bled into fountains, statues taller than temples, a city not of Rome's history, but of Nero's vanity. It was magnificent. It was obscene. It was a poem written in bone and soot. Those who dared to question him disappeared. Architects who objected to his plans met sudden ends. Poets who rivaled his verse were accused of treason. He surrounded himself with flatterers, artists who knew the price of honesty. To love Nero was to survive him. To outshine him, dare even by accident, was to vanish. But his need for admiration became an addiction. He traveled to Greece, not as emperor, but as performer. He entered every contest, recited every line. No judge dared deny him a prize. And when he returned, it was not with laurels, but with illusions. He believed the world had accepted his divinity. He believed his words could heal the wounds he'd carved into Rome. They could not. Behind him the Senate plotted. The people murmured. Even the army, the final pillar of any Roman ruler, had began to waver. They did not fear his madness, they feared his weakness. And in Rome, a weak god becomes a corpse. But Nero could not see it. He had become the man who speaks to shadows and calls it applause. the man who watches his empire fracture and thinks it's a metaphor. Even as the assassins drew close, he composed. His final words were not those of a tyrant. They were those of a failed artist. What an artist dies in me. He was still alive when the silence began. Not the silence of mourning, but the silence that follows a performance too long, too loud, too selfish. The silence of an audience turning away. Nero once filled palaces with verse and gardens with golden light, but now he walked corridors where even his own echo refused to answer. His face, once sculpted into coins and statues, now hung in doorways like a curse. His name, once chanted, now whispered, not out of reverence, but out of fear. The fire had not ended with Rome. It had followed him, into his court, into his blood, into every thought that refused to kneel, and now it burned quietly behind his eyes. A fire without smoke, a fire that consumes only the soul. He had believed once that art could save him, that beauty was a kind of power more absolute than armies, that if he crafted the perfect verse, the gods would forgive him everything else. But he forgot one thing. The crowd can't be forced to feel what it does not believe, and Rome no longer believed in Nero. He sat in his palace, surrounded by marble and silence. The Domus Aurea, the golden house, was a marvel. But it was not a home. It was a mausoleum built for a man still breathing. The walls were lined with jewels, but the rooms echoed with absence. He wandered them like a ghost who hadn't realized he'd already died. He tried to reclaim them, the people, the favor, the myth. He staged new performances, each more grand than the last. He wrote tragedies and made senators weep, on command. He played every role but the one Rome needed. Not an emperor, not a god, just a man. But Nero was never just a man. He was the child who watched his mother poison emperors and then whisper love with knives behind her back. He was the boy who learned early that survival came not from truth, but from theater. His entire life had been a stage, and he had never stepped off it. Even in confession, he posed. Even in fear, he postured. When messengers brought news of revolts, of generals rising in his name only to renounce it, he didn't panic. He composed. He believed that if he could just find the right words, the story would correct itself. But the story had moved on. Rome had found a new plot. Galba marched. Armies once sworn to Nero now waited to see which way the wind would turn. In the heart of the empire, senators debated how to erase a man they had once carved into history. Still he delayed, not out of confidence, out of denial. His gods had grown silent, his servants had grown pale. Even the mirrors stopped showing the man he thought he was. And so he ran. He fled Rome, dressed as a slave, hiding in gardens where once his statues stood. He begged for mercy from gods he no longer feared. He begged for help from men who had once bowed before him. They turned away. The world had changed. The fire had moved on. And Nero, once its master, now only followed the smoke. They say he died with a blade to his throat, but they also say he couldn't do it. That even in death he needed an audience. That he forced a servant to finish what he could not. And as his lifeblood spilled into the dust, his final thought was not regret, but insult. What an artist dies in me! A line rehearsed. A tragedy written before the curtain ever rose. But the empire did not mourn. Rome did not crumble. The sun rose. The stones cooled. The ashes of the city became mortar for a new one. What Nero never understood was that power doesn't come from creation. It comes from restraint. And the tragedy of his rule wasn't that he wanted beauty too much. It's that he destroyed everything beautiful, trying to own it. The city he burned didn't die, but the poem he imagined, the eternal verse carved in golden arches and singing fountains, was never written, because real greatness doesn't demand applause. It survives silence. And in the end, silence is all he left. It was never about Rome. Not really. It was about how Rome made him feel. The applause, the terror, the way his name echoed louder in the stone than in his own soul. Nero didn't want to rule the empire. He wanted to be worshipped by it. In his mind, the city was a theater. The streets were aisles. The temples were props. The people? Just an audience waiting to be moved. And if they weren't moved, they would be made to move. Through fear, through fire, through spectacle. He built colonnades so wide they swallowed markets, fountains that bled wine, a revolving dining room that turned with the stars. He filled it all with verses, his verses, and statues of gods that looked suspiciously like himself. He wasn't leading Rome, he was composing it. But art to Nero was not expression. It was control. It was the only way he knew to keep the voices quiet, the ones that reminded him of what he was born into, of how the people cheered his rise only after he let his mother die, of how he murdered his pregnant wife in a rage and then mourned her like a tragic hero, of how he kicked his second wife to death and then tried to replace her with a boy who looked just like her. He was writing a script that no longer followed the rules of the world around him, but Rome was watching. And eventually, even the best actors run out of stage. He knew the city would not forget the fire. They whispered that he started it himself, that while neighborhoods turned to ash, he stood on a rooftop in golden robes and sang of Troy, that he wept, not for the burning, but for how beautifully it mirrored the epics. The truth didn't matter. Perception had already taken root, and once the people believed he had burned their homes for the sake of a metaphor, no poem could ever save him. So he blamed the Christians, an obscure sect, already hated, already feared. He had them arrested, tortured, nailed to crosses, set on fire in his gardens, human torches to light his own descent. He turned cruelty into theater again, and mistook the silence of the crowd for awe, but the silence had changed. It no longer trembled. It waited. And behind that silence was a question no emperor can afford to ask aloud. What if they are no longer afraid? Nero had built a world of mirrors, but mirrors don't lie. They reflect. And what he saw reflected was not a god, not a savior, but a frightened child who never learned to love without taking, who never spoke without demanding applause, who confused violence with meaning and attention with affection. He'd grown up in the shadows of daggers, the son of Agrippina, who whispered her way through power and poisoned her way past rivals. She taught him that survival meant eliminating threats before they had names, that love could be transactional, that loyalty meant nothing without leverage. So he turned every court into a chessboard, every friend into a liability, every moment of silence into a threat, and still he called it fur art. But even the most beautiful aria cannot change the sound of footsteps leaving. When governors in the provinces stopped replying, when generals stopped obeying, when senators began remembering their spines, he knew. He knew he had become a ghost in his own empire. He wandered the Golden House like a prisoner, a palace too vast for whispers to carry, too empty for echoes to return. He surrounded himself with yes-men and eunuchs, and still their flattery tasted like dirt. He forced applause, and it felt like thunder without rain. Rome didn't just want a leader, it needed one. And Nero had mistaken spectacle for substance for too long. When the rebellion reached the outskirts, he still held on to ritual. He tried to perform his own death, rehearsing final words, mourning his own demise like a poet staging the end of a play. He wanted a legacy, not of power, but of tragedy. But tragedy is only beautiful when it's not real. And this was very real. The people didn't weep. They didn't protest. They watched. And the silence they offered was not the silence of reverence. It was the silence of relief. Because Rome could burn and still be rebuilt. But a soul that burns everything in its grasp, that cannot be saved. What he destroyed wasn't just architecture. It was trust, faith, the belief that the man in charge was building something larger than himself. Nero never believed in Rome, only in the mirror. And in the end, even that cracked. You can tell a man's truth by how he dies. When the Senate finally turned on him, when his own guards abandoned him, Nero didn't go out like the tyrant of Roman nightmares. He didn't fight. He didn't command. He didn't even beg. He wandered, lost, barefoot, dressed in rags, trembling like a shadow that had slipped from its owner. He fled not from enemies, but from the sound of his own name. For days he hid in the outskirts of Rome, in the crumbling villa of a freedman. His empire, his golden, blood-drenched stage, was reduced to a hole in the ground where he could cower, shivering at every approaching footstep. The once divine voice of Rome's god-emperor now whispered only this, "Have I neither friend nor foe left?" It's said that when the time came, when execution was no longer a threat but a certainty, he asked another man to do what he couldn't, end his life. And when even that failed, Nero, trembling, weeping, plunged a dagger into his own throat. He died not with a roar, but with a gasp. Qualis artifex pereo? What an artist dies with me. His last words were not about Rome, not about justice, not even about legacy. They were about art, his performance. Because even at the edge of the abyss, Nero still thought the world was watching. And maybe in a way it was. History would watch, and misremember, and retell. Some would say he was insane. Others misunderstood. Some would call him evil. Others a reflection. But none would forget him. Because in the end, that's all Nero ever wanted. And yet, what did he really leave behind? A burned city, a silent senate, a trail of bodies, mothers, wives, friends, mentors, a kingdom that cheered when he died, not out of triumph but out of exhaustion. He turned Rome into theater, but forgot that an audience doesn't clap forever, that even the most tragic performance becomes parody when the pain is too real, that gods made of marble cannot bleed for the people they rule. And now, his golden house was ransacked, his statues defaced, his name stripped from every inscription, every monument. The empire tried to erase him, as if the memory of Nero could be purged like smoke from a chamber. But you can't erase a ghost. He lingers in every tyrant who believes beauty can excuse cruelty, in every leader who confuses applause with love, in every man who inherits power and mistakes it for divinity. Nero wasn't just a man. He was a warning of what happens when the soul of a child is locked inside the crown of an emperor, when trauma is mistaken for destiny, when a poet believes that burning the world makes his song more powerful. He wasn't the first to fall this way, and he wouldn't be the last, because empires are always tempted to choose spectacle over substance, to fall in love with the echo of a man instead of his silence, to build golden stages instead of sturdy homes. The story of Nero didn't end with his death. It became a script, passed down to every ruler who sings louder than he listens. And maybe that's why we keep telling it, not to remember him, but to recognize him. Rome did not mourn Nero. The streets did not weep. The stones did not echo his name. When the news of his death spread through the city, it was not grief that followed. It was a breath, a long collective exhale, as if the empire itself had been holding its lungs, unsure whether the man who ruled them was real or merely a fever they all endured together. But something strange happened. In the decades that followed, quietly, almost secretly, people began whispering that Nero hadn't died at all, that he had escaped, that the gods had spared him, that he would return. And in those whispers you can hear something far more terrifying than tyranny: nostalgia. Because for all his madness, all his cruelty, Nero had created something people couldn't forget. A spectacle so grand, so unrelenting, that silence felt unbearable without it. The man who burned a city for poetry had carved himself into their minds, not as a monster, but as a myth. The legend of the false Neros began not in Rome, but at its borders. In far-flung provinces where the emperor was more symbol than man, impostors emerged. Men claiming to be Nero returned to restore glory. And people believed them, not because they trusted the face, but because they missed the story. A world without Nero felt too still, too sober, too real, and that was Nero's greatest trick. He made reality feel unbearable. He made people crave the fantasy of him. He transformed power into performance, and performance into memory. Even after death, his myth lived on, not through reverence, but through repetition, like a song you can't stand but can't stop humming, like a wound that never quite scars. You see, tyrants don't vanish when they fall. They echo. They become metaphors. They slip into the blood of a nation, into the fears of the next generation, because once you've seen what madness looks like in royal robes, once you've watched fire dancing where law once stood, you never quite see the world the same again. And the empire, it tried to move on. New emperors rose. Some were wise, others worse. But none could completely silence the ghost in the marble halls. The golden boy with the dagger, the poet with a torch, the god who cried for applause. He had turned the throne into a stage, and once that curtain was lifted, it could never be closed again. Even now, historians argue. Was he truly insane? Or merely a product of an impossible inheritance? Was he born a monster, or broken into one? Did he burn Rome out of malice, or did he honestly believe he was birthing something beautiful? The truth is, Nero was never one man. He was a prism. Every eye that looked upon him saw something different. A tyrant, a child, an artist, a joke, a god, a devil. But one thing was certain. He made sure you looked. And maybe that was his only real ambition. Not to be loved, not even to be feared, but to be remembered. Even if all he left behind was ash. What do you call a man who lights a fire beneath history, just to see the shadows it casts? What do you call a ruler who believes beauty justifies cruelty and art excuses horror? You call him emperor, but you also call him something else. You call him a mirror, because the most terrifying truth about Nero isn't that he was mad, it's that he wasn't entirely alone in his madness. He simply had the throne to make it visible. Strip away the crown, and what remains is a boy raised to believe he was a god, a child sculpted by power, praise, and fear until he could no longer distinguish applause from love or worship from survival. He inherited an empire and thought it was a canvas, and when the people did not cheer his strokes of genius, he burned the canvas down. Not out of hatred, but out of need, because nothing frightened Nero more than being unseen. Every decision he made, every execution, every spectacle, it all whispered the same question. Do you still see me? He turned Rome into his audience, his reflection, his judge, and when it didn't reflect what he wanted to see, he shattered the mirror, burned the stage, silenced the actors. Not even his mother could escape the performance. She who made him emperor, she who manipulated the court with elegance and venom, she who died by his order, because her shadow was too large for him to outshine. He didn't just kill her, he mythologized her death, sent assassins who failed, then sent again, ordered her to die with a finality that felt theatrical, not because he needed to. He had already won, but because her exit had to be part of the narrative. Nero didn't rule Rome, he directed it. And what is a director without control? What is a god when the crowd no longer believes? He wept for applause, not because he was cruel, but because cruelty was the only language he had left. And that is the tragedy. Not the fire, not the blood, but the hollow scream of a man who mistook silence for rejection and fear for failure. Rome didn't collapse under Nero. It survived. But it survived knowing what it had been willing to accept, what it had clapped for, what it had watched from the balconies, wine in hand as flames danced across its skyline. And maybe that's the real horror. That's somewhere in the burning, in the madness, in the poetry. It was beautiful. There is no comfort in history, only confrontation. Nero's story doesn't end with his death. It ends in every ruler who believes image is truth, in every society that confuses spectacle with substance, in every citizen who prefers theater over truth, until the fire comes for them too. This emperor burned an entire city for a poem, but the poem wasn't for Rome. It wasn't for the gods. It was for himself, an ode to his own echo. And maybe the only honest line he ever spoke wasn't a verse, but a whisper the night before his end. What an artist dies in me. But the artist didn't die. He just changed form. He became the warning carved into every empire's foundation. Be careful what you applaud, because it might not be greatness. It might just be fire.